Hello to everybody, I'm Marco Beato, Associate Professor in Sport and Exercise Science at University of Suffolk. Thank you for your attention and your presence in this event. I want to introduce you Alejandro, that will present for us this presentation, the use of flywheel resistant training devices in strength condition programs. So thank you, Alejandro, for your presentation.
Thank you, Marco. It's a pleasure for me to speak to you and to the people who's already watching this presentation. And thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here, sharing my expertise and my knowledge on the use of flywheel resistant training devices in strength and conditioning programs. My name is Alejandro Mun Lopez. I'm from Seville, Spain. I'm PhD in sports science, and I got some master sciences on high performance team sports, especially related to football. I'm former Latvian national team fitness coach and head of sports science department. And nowadays, I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Human Movement and Sports Performance at the University of Seville. During this presentation, I will be covering 5 questions that I think are of very practical importance to understand what is a flywheel resistant training device. And the first question, how are they used in practice? Maybe for some of you are basic knowledge, but I will try to introduce some of the different problems we're facing nowadays when we implement those technologies, either in research or strength and conditioning real programs. So the first question is, what's a flywheel resistant training device and how are they used in practice? So if we think on 2 different resistant training paradigms, we can speak about isoinertial. When I speak about isoinertial, I always refer to free weights, because to my opinion, a flywheel device is not isoinertial, because the inertia is the same, but it varies because of the rotary axis, something which I will explain in a moment. So if we compare flywheel devices to isoinertial or free weights, what we have is that most of the free weights equipment or technologies are to produce a linear movement compared to flywheel devices, which the movement nature is a rotary movement. If we think or if we focus on the gravity influence, we know that the free weights can have low to high influence. In example, if it's horizontal, we'll have lower gravity influence compared to vertical movements. And the gravity influence in the flywheel devices is always low. It's not such high as the isoinertial free weights. So for this reason, comparing both, while the free weights have the external load constant along the run, which led to standardize the load, that it's one of the most important things in strength and conditioning programs, as you know. In flywheel devices, the external load is variable along the run, because the axis, the rotary shaft, varies along the run. For this reason, in free weights, the physical laws that explains the movement are close to the nature of most of the sports skills. Let's say it's more specific. And the physical laws that explains the movement in the flywheel devices are not such close. It doesn't mean that it hasn't got any kind of utility, but you must be aware of that, because, for example, the way you produce force or speed is not specific to the way it's later on gonna happen during the real sport and the real movement. For that reason, free weights are easier to be monitored, in example, using speed. And in flywheel devices, despite speed is still easier to be analyzed, other mechanical variables are more difficult, like force, which cannot be directly computed from speed, for example. So what is a flywheel resistant training device? A flywheel resistant training device, it's a resistant training equipment where the athlete pulls a rope or a strap, like in this device here, to rotate the external load, which usually is a flywheel disc, over our rotary axis. So in this video, we're showing this is the concentric phase and the eccentric phase. One of the main difficulties that you may find if you are not used to flywheel devices is to understand that during the whole concentric phase, the disc rotates to the same side, and then only on the next repetition starts to recoil to the other side. This is important. So what you do with those devices, and of course others, is you generate an energy during the concentric phase. And what the flywheel technology provides is that during the eccentric phase, the exactly same amount of energy is given back on the eccentric phase. So you cannot have more energy on the eccentric phase compared to the concentric phase. And this is very important in relation to what is a real eccentric overload, as I will explain later. If we talk about different types of flywheel devices, we can divide in horizontal cylinder platforms, like this one, or a conic pulley, like the right one. Both of them usually have a flywheel disc that usually in horizontal cylinder platforms can be changed directly, but on the conic pulley, you change these small weights around to increase the moment of inertia. The main difference between both of them is the rotary axis. While in a conic pulley, it's much more variable along the rome, in the horizontal cylinder still is variable because the strap recoils around it, but it's less variable at the end. How do you execute an exercise on a flywheel device? First of all, you need to do the rome setting, okay? So first, you must ensure that the strap is tied at the end of the rome, like in this video. This is one of the good things of the flywheel devices because you can create the rome safely. That will assure that the flywheel disc will stop the rotation at the end of the desired rome, as we see in this video. In example, if you don't want such high elbow flexion, you can decrease the height of the strap, so the movement can be stopped at the middle of the concentric phase, for example. Immediately after the end of the concentric phase or the end of the rome, the eccentric phase will start. In a horizontal cylinder shaft, or even on a conic pulley, you can have a larger rome, which will make a delay between the concentric and the eccentric phase, like we showed in that video. This could be an option for some given purposes on the strength and conditioning programs. Regarding force vectors, we can say that in an horizontal cylinder shaft, basically the force is vertically produced, like we show in these videos. But you can put, if you, with a small imagination, you can put the platform horizontally, vertically, and you can do also horizontal movements, like this one. This is the back of a biode, isokinetic dynamometer. And this is a research we did doing leg extension during 30 repetitions. In contrast, when you use a conic shaft, it allows for 3D movements. Okay, so many people use this option to replicate the specificity of the movement in the real sport, as you see here. So once we know what is a flywheel device, the question two is, what do they add to the resistance training equipment options? What are their benefits? I must say that the origins of those flywheel devices came from a consultancy by the MESSA, by Berg and Tesk, to fight the weightlessness effects of the space. Since then, and the first papers, this is the first paper which is published in 1994 by Berg and Tesk. This is the first flywheel devices that we find in the literature. And the second one in 1998, where they see the options of those devices to increase the peak force on the eccentric phase compared to the concentric phase. If we analyze all the repetitions here, we see that during the eccentric phase, there is always a higher peak force. This is why those devices were suggested to produce eccentric overload. This is the first reference where the people started to think that flywheel devices were developed to have a greater eccentric training compared to other kind of technologies, which is something that we are trying to prove right now, that not all the time should be like that. And this is very important. if you see, as I explained from the origins, flywheel was like equal to eccentric overload. There's many research that they use on the titles eccentric overload, the work eccentric overload, just because they use a flywheel device. And most of them, they do not prove that. Actually, we prove that flywheel is not equal to flywheel. We found that eccentric overload is only shown on peak variables, and it's not shown on mean variables because, as I said, you have the same exactly amount of energy or even less on the eccentric phase compared to the concentric phase. The only way to have the eccentric overload is to decrease the range of motion on the eccentric phase or delay the break of that energy, so you can create a higher peak. So it is we call the flywheel devices as passive devices, and in passive devices you cannot have a real eccentric overload. But anyway, if we use the term eccentric overload, it is shown that it's more suitable to use lower moments of inertia and an horizontal cylinder compared to a vertical cone to achieve the eccentric overload. In contrast, vertical cones can help on achieving more significant higher concentric outputs, which at the end is also very important for sports performance. Talking about the benefits of the flywheel, what about how their effects on improving volume and force? So again, it's interesting to see here in this very nice meta-analysis from my colleagues Francisco Núñez and Eduardo Sáez, where they showed that they had increments in both muscle volume and force, but actually the group which did not achieve eccentric overload had a higher increase in the muscle volume. If we think on the effects on strength training, it is shown that most of the effects of the flywheel devices are proved on improving the maximal strength. And it is interesting to see how the horizontal performance is mostly impaired or decreased when those devices are used compared especially to the vertical performance, where the performance is improved. We don't know yet, to my opinion, why is that, but probably, and this is just a hypothesis of mine, that could be related to the external load used, probably a very high external load. And this is some of the points that we still don't know in the flight. What about their effects compared to gravity-dependent resistance training? Let's say that gravity-dependent is called the free weights or the isoinertial, and non-gravity dependent, the flywheel. But some recent research suggested that there is a low influence of the gravity, so we cannot call them gravity independent because we are still on the Earth, so we cannot say that. So there are doubtful results when we compare both technologies, and we cannot say that one is better than the other one to improve muscle strength. And probably this is due to the lack of knowledge on exercise intensity prescriptions or the equivalence use to compare the loads among both devices. Because we know that on a concrete manufacturer's bench press, 80 kilos is the same as on the other one, but we don't know the equivalence between 80 kilos and any given moment of inertia to could compare really the effects. So the third question is, how are the mechanics compared to an isoinertial load? And among different types of devices, how are those different? To my opinion, this is one of the first questions that any strength and conditioning coach or anyone who will be using this technology should ask himself or herself before using the device. Why? Because the way the mechanics are produced along the run determines the effects of the training. If we compare, if we see, for example, how are the mechanics under isoinertial load, in a standard squat, we see that the speed is increased until the end of the concentric phase, and the force, the peak force, is achieved a bit earlier. If we have a counter movement jump, let's say squat with a flight time, we see how this peak speed is delayed most to the end of the phase. This is what really happens during the competition in most of the sports. But what is happening in a flywheel device? In a flywheel device, of course, here we're talking about vertical force production, which is measured with a linear encoder. But here we present a rotary encoder, all right, in radians per second. And we are not using the vertical one because most of the rotary encoders, which are already on the flywheel devices, provide this rotary speed. So it's good to start to understand and to compare both kinds of speeds. So what we can see here is that the peak speed is always achieved at the end of the concentric phase, let's say between the transition of both phases. So if we talk about specificity, we see that the flywheel device is more related to an inertial exercise, but with a flight time. So you can delay this kind of peak, okay? And here, what we present is mostly the same, but now we include on the inertial heavy bands, super loop bands. So we still see that even including the bands, which is a variable resistance training device, like the flywheel, will have mostly the same results compared to the Smith machine. But what about the force? What about net force, which is the force that the athlete really executes, really performs? So if we see the flywheel, it is very interesting because since the movement is changed repetition to repetition more compared to an inertial load, we see how along the concentric phase force is decreased, but then is increased at the end of the eccentric phase. If we think on eccentric overload, many people say, okay, eccentric overload, you need to use flywheel. Look here, look at the jump, look at the peak of the eccentric force compared to concentric here, and even when you use loops, super loops. So in terms of eccentric overload, probably both inertial loads are producing a higher eccentric overload compared to the flywheel. So is it really important that eccentric overload? This is something that maybe still needs to be discovered. Also, once we know the mechanics compare inertial to flywheel, we need to understand the mechanics comparing the two kinds of devices, the conical pulley, and here it's the yo-yo, which is an horizontal cylinder. So when we used, and we published on this research, when we used the same moments of inertia exactly on both devices and squat, we see how, first of all, the time of the concentric and the eccentric phase is dramatically different. Almost 60% of the time in both phases in the conical pulley compared to the horizontal cylinder. If we see peak vertical velocity on the conic pulley is almost double compared to the yo-yo, and we're talking about the highest moment of inertia. For those who have not used flywheel devices, a moment of inertia of 0.3, it's too much low. If we talk about the mean force, we see more or less same loads. And if we see the impulse, we really see differences between both types of devices. Almost 60% more on the horizontal cylinder compared to the conic pulley. So what we really saw is that when you use an horizontal cylinder, you can have more force, as is presented here on the red line, along most of the concentric phase, of the repetition. You can see here the office differences, of course, are more notable during the eccentric phase, but when you use the conic pulley, you always have a higher speed between both devices. Mostly significant difference along the whole concentric phase and along the whole eccentric phase. So it is good to know for resistance training programs which kind of flywheel device use. Not to use a flywheel device or an inertial load, which kind? Because we're talking about the same exercise and same moment of inertia here. And what is provoking, what is the fact, which is the mechanical part that is affecting that? It is the shaft. As we saw before, let me go back. the higher variability, the higher variation of this shaft is doing that the torque is different along the rung, is much more variated along the rung on the conic pulley compared to the horizontal cylinder. And this is why this is, as long as higher torque you have here, you have more possibility to achieve a higher speed because you need to apply a lower force. So in terms of same moment of inertia, you will have a higher load on the horizontal cylinder. This is why you need to improve your force level, your applied force. So let me go back. Okay, and the next question is, once we know that, how can we monitor that? How to monitor the binomial intensity or workload and training volume, which are the main two training variables, to my opinion. So for that, you can use a software like SmartCo. And the good point of SmartCo is that it has been there since the beginning. It was involved in this MESSA project of the consultancy of Berg and Tesk. Actually, Tesk was one of the first owners of SmartCo. Then they were divided, and they were there from the beginning. So the software can allow very good to monitor the flywheel. You have two kinds of functions. You can do a standalone version or in a pro mode where the database is stored on a server, so you can monitor different kinds of technologies at the same time under the same database, which is very good. And it has some important features like a powerful user-friendly training editor. And as I said, you can program any kind of exercise. But if we focus on the flywheel, one of the good options it has is that you can do progressive loading tests. Just recently, on the last 2 years, the research which is being done is more related to understand the mechanical characteristic and the intensity and volume of the flywheel devices. So as you can do using isoinertial loads, you can do progressive loading tests to help on the determination of the external load. At the moment, the only options that we have, as at least to my knowledge, is to use an absolute mechanical load or a relative mechanical load, depending on the peak power. That's the two options that you have to program an exercise. And you can also create, as is shown in this research by Darjan and colleagues in 2020, the force velocity profile. But you need to be aware that the real load, the real workload or intensity of the flywheel depends in both moment of inertia and the shaft radius, the axis. If you see the different kind of research, you can see an overload, a progressive overload when you increase the load. So this is a good news because you can apply the overload principle of resistance training programs also using those devices. But as I said, it is just information about absolute loads, nothing relative for the moments. And here also you can see how peak concentrical, vertical, or eccentric and mean velocity is decreased as long as you increase the moment of inertia, which means that the highest moment of inertia has a greater external workload. This is, for example, how it looks on the SmartCo, a progressive loading test. So you can have the peak power. Actually, the software is saying to you, what is your optimal inertia could improve your peak power, and what is the estimation of your peak power and at which speed you can achieve that. If we talk now about volume, you know that there is a high trend on velocity-based training, and that volume is not nowadays on resistance training programs set up as before. Before we said, okay, you need to perform or execute 4 sets of 10 repetitions. Now we say 4 sets of a given percentage of mechanical loss. So the first, to my knowledge, the first paper which covered that was that one from my colleague Rafael Sabido, where they showed that over 15 repetitions, first of all, you need the first 3-4 repetitions to could achieve the peak, the highest concentric or eccentric power, and then you see how along the repetitions is decreased. So we can use similar to a velocity-based training approach. Maybe we need to call power-based training or acceleration-based training, as I will present right now. I don't know yet, but you can do the same with the flywheel. Actually, what we showed recently on the Journal of Biomechanics, which was just published, is we studied what variable better shows the workload and the fatigue along the repetitions. And we saw that the peak acceleration, and actually acceleration, is the variable which better reflects that workload, because we saw doing a principal component analysis that this is only concentric phase, okay? We are not focused now on the eccentric phase. So we saw that after the peak acceleration, we found the highest variation among different moments of inertia, as you see here, and among different kind of repetitions. What you see here is the first 5th repetition, the 10th repetition, 15th, 20th, 25th, and 30th repetitions. So the highest variation is presented here. And this is how it looks, both mean acceleration and peak acceleration over 3 sets, executing 30 repetitions of the leg extension exercise using an horizontal cylinder. So this must be proved on other kind of flywheels, but at least we now have more information. And what we saw is that at the 20th repetition, there were no more significant changes. So it is some kind of plateau here where there's no point to still executing repetitions. And we saw at the 20th repetition that in this exercise, you have a 20% of loss of speed, a 30% of loss of acceleration, and a 40% of loss of power. For example, you can do this in the Smart Coach. You can select here either speed or power, and you can put the feedback on concentric average power or peak, even on eccentric overload, and use this tolerance to have the mechanical loss. Also, you can have a variable profile which will change every repetition, the percentage compared, for example, to the best of the initial 3 repetitions or the average of those repetitions. How it looks is something like that. This is 30 repetitions of horizontal rowing executing on a conic pulley with the load that exerted the peak power of the athlete. So you can see how mostly from the 6th repetition, the athlete already lost 20% of the average power in this case. And this is why the repetitions are shown on blue, on green when you are on the range, and on red when you are higher in the range. This is how it looks, the peak power, and officially you can see how it is higher during the whole set on the eccentric phase compared to the concentric phase. So we can say that the eccentric overload is achieved. And this is how it looks, the mean speed, which basically doesn't show that eccentric overload. And this is how it shows the work, which is a nice measure of volume. And last question it is about, is it really important, the eccentric phase? And what is eccentric overload? Okay, to introduce the concept of eccentric overload, let me explain first what could be a concentric overload. It's very simple. You have a concentric overload when you have anything higher on the concentric phase compared to the eccentric phase, and you have an eccentric overload when you have something higher on the eccentric phase compared to concentric phase. And this is very important because people usually say eccentric overload and they don't say on which variable. And this is very, very important. Then we can say, and we can start to classify what is the range of the eccentric overload. When the peak power is the same at the same height on the concentric phase and the eccentric phase, there is no overload. When the peak power is a bit higher, we can say on the eccentric phase, we can say it's a low overload. And when the peak power is much higher, we can say it's a high overload. Thanks to Marco Pozzo from SmartCo for giving me these slides. And also on the SmartCo software, you can monitor with real-time feedback the eccentric overload. Here, we set the software to show a 30% of eccentric overload with a range of 20% of error. So here you see that there is no eccentric overload. When there is green bars, means that you are on the range of the eccentric overload, so 30%. The red ones is when you achieve an eccentric overload higher than 30%. So this is another option to be used, even monitor in real time with Flywheel devices. Here, if we pick again the same 30 repetitions from the previous athlete, we see how the eccentric overload is achieving the whole repetitions, but is now classified on 30% in the range or higher to 30% over the range. And why depends on the variable, the eccentric overload? We have here 5 repetitions. We have force, we have speed, and we have power. And we have concentric phase, eccentric phase, concentric, eccentric. This is how it looks, the time course of those variables when you execute 5 repetitions of the flywheel on the same set. So if you see here and we focus just on the peak force, we clearly see how there is on the first 3 repetitions an eccentric overload, because you have a higher of something, in that case force, on the eccentric phase compared to the concentric. But about speed, is not possible with the rotary speed to have an eccentric overload because the peak divides both phases. But what about power? Since power is the product of force times speed, what we have here is that peak power is not, in this case, in this sample, it's not showing an eccentric overload. So be aware when you use the term eccentric overload to refer exactly to which variable you are talking about on each case. And the reason why is that because when you achieve the peak force on the eccentric phase is at the end of the eccentric phase mostly, because this is the place where you break usually, and it is at the same time of a low speed. That's why the peak power could be lower here. The only option is to achieve this eccentric overload here, and you will have this eccentric overload, but again, it's not a real eccentric overload, it's on the peak power, not on mean variables. So finishing with my presentation as take-home messages or key-home messages, flywheel resistant training devices are suitable equipment to be considered in resistant training programs. They allow to increase muscle size and improve power or maximum strength. Many research suggested that they can be used to reduce the injury risk due to the eccentric overload, but this is not proof in most of the paper published. There is not still an established method to program the workload using a relative index in flywheel, and the acceleration peak can be used during real-time feedback to reflect the absolute workload and fatigue, similar to velocity loss and with a similar approach to velocity-based training, but using flywheel devices. Thank you very much for your time. You got my contact there. And now, Marco, if you have any questions, thank you again for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Alejandro. It's been really a pleasure. So a lot of information, honestly, and you discussed a lot of fakes that obviously maybe we have found in our research before. So, for example, the problem of the terminology. Frequently, we use eccentric overload when we need to prove that you have an eccentric overload. And also a nice thing that you said, obviously, is when we talk about power and we're monitoring power, and we say, yes, we have eccentric overload evaluating power. Sometimes, obviously, force and velocity move around. So sometimes you can say, yes, we have eccentric overload in power, but maybe your force is lower than what you expect, or because obviously power is a combination of speed and force. So brilliant. So I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, if you need to give some practical tips to about flywheel training monitoring to your practitioner or some practitioners, what you like to suggest to people that work, for example, with team sport that they don't have, or with also single athletes, but that they don't have so much time to evaluate maybe all the metrics that you showed. So if you needed to give some practical tips, what should they monitoring in your opinion?
Well, at the moment, with the knowledge that we have, maybe you can focus on power, because at the end, power is interesting. Of course, we are talking about power in the angular momentum, not in the linear momentum, and you cannot compare the number of watts. And you don't need to focus on just do a high amount of power all the time. High power, high power, high power. We saw another research that using the load from all the range on the VersaPulley on a specific exercise which replicates the first step of the sprint, using the peak power load, the amount of time that you are doing force during the concentric phase is around 500 milliseconds. And we saw with an accelerometer at the back that the first step of the sprint is 400 milliseconds. And the second one is already 300 milliseconds. If we talk about specificity, you need to use a load which is closer to the amount of time you are executing force in the real movement, and not focus on just power, 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 and power. So it's good to monitor this power, but you don't need to focus on always high, high. Maybe the lowest load of the flywheel is enough, and you need to monitor how you improve your power, but with the lowest load, probably. And of course, you probably don't need to do all the days, but if you got the technology and you got the facility to could monitor all at the same time, like for example, I showed the SmartCo Pro system, it's nice. But don't get mad if you don't have, because you can have the single computer and you can maybe monitor around 3-4 players along the week, and then another 3-4 players the other week, because at the end, you need to play with the biological adaptation time, and you will not find those adaptations within the week.
Perfect, thank you. And I have a second question, and after I think we are all happy about your presentation and all the information that you give to us. So the second question is, when we talk about familiarization, obviously based on your experience, how many sessions should we plan with our athletes? We're supposed to have someone that, I'm in the UK, and here the technology is a bit less spread, I could say, and frequently we have football player or athletes that don't have any experience with this type of technology. How many sessions do you suggest to have a familiarization? So I don't mean to achieve an optimum level of training, but a familiarization.
Nice question. And I know that many colleges, reviewers and editors are going to kill me with my response, with my answer. But the research suggests 2, 3, 4 sessions. I do not agree. I think it's much more. The issue is that in research we haven't got much more time usually, and it's not bad to use 2, 4 familiarization training sessions, but you need to be aware that you are not using expertise people. That's all. So it is like they are familiarized, but without expertise, which is what you said. And when we use in the real practice, we never use first the flywheel. We usually use therabands. We usually use super loops. First of all, because at the end of the concentric, it it's pushing you back because of the hook low, and this is something similar which is happening to the flywheel. So first of all, you can use the super loops. Then you can maybe even use, if you are gonna do 3D movements, you can use a pneumatic like Kaiser, like the Kaiser Infinity, because you can reply the movement, but without expertise starting to do a specific movement with the flywheel, it is dangerous. It will not work. Of course, the coordinative load will be massive, but don't try to monitor that. It is another interesting approach, which is to monitor the movement variability using the variability of the speed or the power or whatever. Many people say that you need to change the external load once you are used to it. So when you don't create that variation. So maybe we don't need to focus on familiarize, because once the athlete is familiar with the load and with the exercise, probably the effect, it would not be such high. So maybe we always need to be familiarization the athlete. This is the approach, I think.
Thank you for your answer. So I give you also my point, since we are chatting a bit, and we chat also before obviously the registration. We have seen, at least in with my group, that depend a lot of the previous expertise that the practitioner had anyway with traditional resistance training. So we have seen that if someone was doing, for example, squat with barbell, was quite good in that, moving to the flywheel wasn't so complicated. In yes, 3-4 sessions was absolutely all right. Sometimes also in 2 sessions was all right. But other country players that maybe didn't have that type of experience, they struggle. But they could have struggled anyway in the same way also with a barbell, because you cannot go in a gym and lift 100% of your 1 RM after 2 sessions. You don't do that. So that is, I think, so based on your expertise with the strength training. And the second one, like you said, based on the complexity of the movement. So a squat is a thing, maybe a lunge is a thing, but do some rotation and complicate the movement also with the other, I don't know, also external stimulus like a ball or something like that, became very complicated. So in that case, you need for sure, in my opinion, more than the 2-3 sessions that generally are recommended, but that's because the movement is very, very complicated. But anyway, say we agree on that is very dependent, and we need to understand obviously what we want to achieve. If familiarization is a thing, produce an optimal movement is another. But we can talk about that for days and weeks.
I do agree.
So I would like to thank you so much, Alejandro. It's been a brilliant presentation, and obviously I think like I have everybody here took something at home after obviously your presentation, and thank you so much for your time.